Okay, we're live. Guys, you're listening to Hoppy History with Bob, and today we're going to get into some pretty serious stuff. We're going to talk about Ukraine as we record this podcast. This is day 3 of the Russian invasion. I wanted to chat briefly about why this is happening, and we thought, Ryan and I, that the best way to go around it wasn't to try and explain the war itself, but rather put it in perspective and see what is it that makes Ukraine such a nexus of tension right now. And for that, Ryan and I thought, basically, well, let's go back in history. Let's see what happened during the Cold War, what led to it, because I think we can agree that the Ukraine is a very, very specific place. It's been called the Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder, who wrote a
Book of the same title. Yeah.
exactly, like it's a bestseller for a reason, because it does speaks to the fact that this is a region, there's a part of Ukraine in particular, that has witnessed an extraordinarily amount of violence during the Second World War. So Ryan, I'm not going to ask you your take about the war in Ukraine right now, but rather, what do you think it is that makes Ukraine such a I don't even know how to finish the question. What makes Ukraine so important for the relationship between Europe and Russia?
Well, I mean, reaching back into sort of the sands of time here, right? We have to go back and we have to look at how Russia thinks about the world and how it's thought about the world and how to defend itself. That's really what makes Ukraine the center of this tug of war between its where it stands presently, why Russia is intervening, and why the course toward NATO that they have been pursuing is so contentious. But to understand that, we have to really go back in time and look at how Russia has viewed its interests and its vital strategic interests, so that its own security can be ironclad. So to do that, we have to go back, a long time ago, a galaxy far, far away, somewhere on the Russian taiga. We're looking really at Russian geopolitical strategy, because for Moscow, after the Duchy of Muscovy breaks away, and you get the parting of the ways between the Kiev Rus and the Duchy of Moscow, you have a state that is standing off on its own with no real, what we would consider, natural boundaries that are easily defensible.
Because it's sitting on a quite large plain, right? The famous European plain that goes from the Ural Mountains all the way up to, well, France, basically.
Yeah, and so this has been the traditional invasion highway, east and west, on the European plain. So you can see this all the way back to, as the Mongols came in, the Tartars, every time the Great Migrations back in the Roman period. Like, when there is a nomadic people that comes, pillaging through a particular area, they are traveling along this great east-west axis in Europe. So Russia, all the way back to into the Tsarist period, and even prior to this, was expanding outward, and the strategy has always been to trade space for time. So in the Second World War, in the Napoleonic Wars, in the First World War, the weather is actually a folk hero in Russian history. You have Marshal Mud and General Winter.
I was remembering Diod Moroz from my time studying Russia, which means, it's basically Santa Claus.
Right.
It's like the king of ice, if you want.
Okay.
It's not exactly in the same category, but I'm just saying because you were bringing back memories.
Yeah, same idea though. But like they are the weather are folk characters in the same way as their equivalent of Saint Nicholas, right? So behind that is the idea that, like, you have to keep giving up ground long enough for it to get around springtime when it gets muddy enough. Well, first for it to get around to wintertime, so that it's so cold that it's a better idea to go home than it is to stay here.
Yeah.
And then, then springtime when it gets bogged down enough that the enemy cannot advance further into Russian territory.
And that's what happened during World War II, right? Because Hitler's army is a whole 200 divisions that entered Russian territory.
Yep.
They were supposed to start much earlier in the summer, and then they got distracted by an offensive to the south towards the Middle East. So what happened is they lacked the original forces that they needed, and because of that, they delayed the invasion to Russia by about 3 weeks. These 3 weeks, they mattered at the end of the period it took to cross over the famous European plain and to get to Russia. There's a couple of historians who say, well, had Hitler not decided to delay and to go with the original date, things could have been much, much different.
There's actually a debate about whether or not it would have mattered, because this also ties into the Balkan campaign. Mussolini strikes out immediately prior to Operation Barbarossa gets launched, and he tries to take over basically Greece and Croatia, Albania, all of the states in sort of across the Dalmatian Sea and along the Dalmatian coast. Anyway, he fails, and Germany moves into support. There's been a debate about how important that diversion of forces was, but there's another historian who was looking at the weather who says that there was actually a massive rainfall. So the debate continues as to whether or not the 3 weeks would have just been bogged down in springtime mud regardless. So, but to the point, the timing matters, right? Because there is a massive space that needs to be covered from, at that time, where the boundary lies halfway through Poland as it's divided with Nazi Germany, and to get to Moscow. Part of that is Ukraine. So this is a massive swath of territory in the Soviet Empire that is critical to this broader strategy of defense. And there's a reason that Russia feels historically under threat from Western invaders, is because if you start to reach back into it, it happens time and time again from Hitler being the most recent example backward. Before that, you have... well, we talked about him last time, Ludendorff and Hindenburg actually take part in this, and in 1917 signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which carves off, Ukraine declares its independence as part of the Soviet Republic. Well, rather than work backwards, let's take a step back and work forward.
Okay.
So, big picture, on the one hand, we have this space for time strategy that is integral to Russian defense. Second point is the idea that to be a viable great power, to be a nation that can project its influence out into the world, Russia needs access to warm water ports. So this goes back, again, 300 years, when Crimea, this is why the Baltic states are so important, and this is also why Crimea is so important, is because those are the warm water ports. Absent those, the only ports of call that Russia has are in Arkhangelsk or in the far, far east. And both of those ports freeze over during winter. So without the Baltics to access out into the North Seas, and without Crimea to access south down through the Bosporus Straits into the Mediterranean, Russia is unable to project itself as a sort of great empire. This is such an issue that even if we now skip ahead another 100 years up into the mid-1800s, well, first we have Napoleon. This is the first of these great invasions that reinforces this idea that the Russian siege mentality, that the West is going to invade and deal with us, right? And we are living in a constant existential threat of invasion. Napoleon in 1812, the year of the Great Overture, right? That's
anyway. The opening. That's the opening soundtrack in Risk, the digital game.
Really?
Yeah, you can play against the computer.
Appropriately enough.
It's a really, really, really old game. I think it dates from the early 2000s, and it starts with the 1812 Overture.
Right.
It's majestic.
It is, and I mean like that. Yeah, there's a lot to be said about. There's actually a whole lot about like Soviet orchestras capturing different totalitarian themes. Anyway, that's a different.
We'll get into that at some point.
Yeah, but anyway. That piece of music, that was the soundtrack of 1812. That was the soundtrack of Napoleon's invasion of Russia, which again, due to the winter, faltered at the gates of Moscow,
right?
Occupied. And again, you see here like Russian strategy of scorched earth. So where they burn out huge sections of Moscow so that it becomes uninhabitable. cannot winter there, and so they're forced into a long retreat out. So skip ahead about 30 years from that point, as part of the Great Game, the imperial great power competition between Great Britain and between Russia, as they begin to essentially carve up the Far East, right? Part of the Opium Wars, subsequent to. But point being, as part of great power imperial competition, the Crimean War arises as a means to essentially try and bottle up Russia and prevent it from projecting influence down through the Mediterranean.
And that's halfway through 18th century?
Halfway through the 18th century, 1830s. So
1830s.
I believe so. So, or 1840s, perhaps. It's somewhere around there.
I think it's closer to the 50s. But it's a major conflict, and I remember reading about the war for Crimea.
Yeah.
And how convoluted the whole story is, because it has to do with the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
And the European powers, on the one hand, wanting to keep this sort of buffer zone,
right,
with quotes the enemy, but also destructing each other from taking over the land if the empire falls.
Right.
But then it seems that the empire is edging towards a much weakened position.
Right.
And it's an opportunity, but it's also a threat. So on the one hand, the European states, France and England, they're fighting each other for influence.
Right.
But they get together in Crimea because they don't want Russia to seize the opportunity, because then Russia gets access to the Mediterranean Sea.
Right. So out of this, we then sort of skip ahead. Then we arrive at World War I. We're back at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And in fact, it's as a result of World War I that we end up with the Soviet Union in the first place. So Hindenburg and Ludendorff are remarkably successful in the Eastern Front in 1914. There is a huge opening move that captures, essentially blunts the Russian army almost entirely as it stands at that point. They shift forces and try and deal a similar knockout blow in the West that degrades into trench positional warfare, static fighting, grinds to a halt in the trenches, all the horrors that are associated with that. And the Eastern Front is comparatively fluid for most of World War I, but is going back and forth. But the Tsarist Russia is never able to field a competent army that's properly equipped, because it's still primarily nobles who are commanding, peasants who are
conscripts.
They are, but they're peasant conscripts who are equipped with essentially rifles against a fully mechanized force.
Right.
Or such as it is for the day. And this ends up resulting in these massive losses, and because these are aristocrats commanding peasants into battle who are serfs still, and in many cases are not emancipated. Like, they don't own themselves. They're not emancipated citizens. They are property of the people who are sometimes commanding them into battle. There's a lot of meat grinders on the Eastern Front. So
must be a pretty horrible sight in some places.
Yeah. Battles off the top of my head are primarily related to the 1914. There's a series of, around Tannenberg, a series of battles that take place in some swamps where, essentially, as a result of personal competition between two field marshals, I think one's a field marshal, maybe both are. An entire army just marches into the jaws of an advancing German force and throws itself away, right? I don't want to overplay the level of incompetence, but there are massive losses, and there is a disregard for human life that results in many of the tensions that were building up over the late 19th century in Russia, and social revolutionaries and the first Duma, the first liberal parties beginning to talk about, like, we do need some type of responsible government. Absolutist Tsarist Russia must render power from the monarchy down to some type of institution of responsible government. That bursts forth. The Germans see an opportunity because Vladimir Lenin, the revolutionary the first head of the Soviet Union, is in exile, and what the Germans do is they arrange to make safe passage for him into to send him to St. Petersburg, and they put him on a train and give him some gold and are like, go have fun,
Do your thing.
do your thing,
Go wild.
yeah. So like it's a very much like an influence operation. They just give him a bunch of money and they turn a revolutionary loose in St. Petersburg, right? And out of the collapse that follows out of this, Germany ends up seizing. Germany takes what was Poland at that time. Essentially, yes. So skip ahead again. The Soviet Union, or you get the beginning of the Russian Civil War, of the revolution. And what the Germans do at Brest-Litovsk is put forth this punishing treaty that Ukraine has broken away at this point as part of this kind of revolutionary collapse that comes about as the war starts to go sideways in 1917. And then, so Germany takes Poland. There are the Baltic states that we talked about, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Of those are supposed to go to German princelings, so they will remain royal states.
They go to princes?
Yeah. Who
Like
will then,
each one has its own prince or king?
will become the head of state for those countries. They will no longer be part of Tsarist Russia.
That seems insane. I mean, the end of the First World War is the end of 4 major empires and or kingdoms, and then this little treaty agrees that these little states will get each
will become new kingdoms. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And Finland's broken off, same reason. There's this huge piece of territory in the north that's broken off as part of Brest-Litovsk.
Right.
And then Ukraine.
Why do we say the Ukraine all the time? I keep hearing the Ukraine, and I still wonder why. Is it? I don't know.
So Ukraine translates as borderland.
So
the borderland is a rather politically dismissive way that the Russians used to refer to this area because it wasn't a country in its own right. It was the borderland that you trade if there's ever an invasion.
if that's true, then the Russian take on it, which you just described, is so compelling that it's got into the English language.
Yeah.
So Ukraine.
Yeah. Ukraine is how we should refer to the country. The Ukraine is to say it is the borderland of Russia.
So it's not a proper noun, it's a generic noun.
In what?
What I mean is the opposite.
Oh, yeah.
So you don't want to say it's a generic noun. You want to say it's a very specific noun.
Yeah.
Right. It has agency, in other words.
Yeah, well, and also by putting the in front of it, you aren't implying that it is the borderland of another state, i.e. Russia, right?
Yeah. It makes it an extension.
Yeah. That's where that all comes from. But so Ukraine has broken away also as a part of the Russian Revolution and stood up on its own. And Brest-Litovsk also ensures that will remain the case, but that a sympathetic government will be set up there.
I was going to ask you if there was a provision or if there was a small character, small fun clause on the bottom of the page that said, by the way, we're going to have influence over the entire place.
Yeah. Okay. So this was vital to the German war plan because 90% of the world's export in wheat to this day come from Ukraine and Russia. And Ukraine was going to provide all of the wheat. So 1917 was called the Hunger Winter in Germany. Something like 200,000 people starved to death. The British blockade by this point was biting very deeply, and caloric intake for adult men had been reduced to 1,500 a day.
And that's for Ukraine?
That's in Germany.
Okay.
Because the British blockade has been preventing all trade coming in. Germany had not prepared itself to be an autarkic state as it did under Hitler prior to the Second World War, right? And so
having
turning Ukraine into a puppet state,
right,
to provide you with cheap food was necessary to continue the war without imports that the British Navy was blocking.
So because of the British Navy, Germany at that time wants the Ukraine for food.
Yes.
That's a bit of a reduction, but it's part of the idea.
Core idea, yeah.
Okay.
And they take Poland as part of the deal.
Mm-hmm.
So out of this, then obviously we know how World War I turns out. The Great Western Offensive falters, fails. Ukraine at this point has already broken away and been set up its own thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the Soviets prevail in the Russian Civil War, they then recognize Ukraine as an independent Soviet Socialist Republic. So Ukraine gets set up as one of these satellite republics within the broader Republican framework of the Soviet Union. Where are we from there? So we've covered basically up to the famine, the Holodomor.
Well, I'm gonna give it up to you. You covered over 500 centuries. 500 years.
Hopefully, I didn't drop too many dates on the wrong way. But
no, but it's unavoidable to cover all the right wars in order to get to where we are right now, because the idea of a buffer zone, at least in the security perception of Russia, seems to be a core pillar of how it views the situation right now.
Yep. And it's important to understand that this is not something that is just coming off the top of their heads. This is something that literally, as you say, has centuries of history behind it, why it's considered vital to the strategic interest in the survival of the Russian state. So,
sometimes in economics, we talk about states that are well endowed with oil and gas and say that they suffer from the you know what that is called? I just lost the word the moment that you said the oil curse.
Yeah,
let's just call it the oil curse.
Sure.
I think that some of our viewers or our listeners will be familiar with the term, and the theory goes that basically the more high value natural resources you are, the more risk you face, or rather the more negatively it impacts your economy. And I'm thinking about Ukraine in terms of natural resources now. Well, it is a basket for Europe. As you said, Russia and Ukraine together export most of the wheat, and now it's impacting the price of wheat, in particular to countries like Egypt that rely extraordinarily on foreign wheat, particularly from Russian wheat. Now the price for Egyptians for wheat has gone up quite high,
right?
Quite a lot, which poses its own set of problems. But if we go back to Ukraine, it has spectacularly fertile soils.
Right.
It also has a high number of mines, but it also has large amounts of territory. So I wonder how much that plays into into the Russian calculations, for instance, historically. Like, is there a calculation that, we need the mines, we need the fertile soil, etc.?
I mean, it's a fair question. The way that I've always heard the issue framed is around this idea of space for time, and about the idea, well, this is skipping ahead a bit, right? We can do the history of NATO and how that becomes a thing too. But if you look at the map and you look at the space, and if Ukraine proceeds to NATO, as was the plan prior to this, right, or was the policy and is part of the Ukrainian constitution now, I believe. If you get to the eastern border of Ukraine, and then you measure that distance out to the Caspian Sea, right, you can cut north-south communication of all of the oil that is essentially the primary export in terms of cash flow for the Russian state by just jumping across that space. So for a state like Russia that believes not only is the idea that space is necessary for its survival, but also that it lives in constant existential threat, that every sort of 50 to 70 years, some aspiring dictator or monarch or absolutist ruler from the West tries to carve off a huge piece of that space for themselves. If you get right to the eastern edge of Ukraine, you can essentially cut the lifeblood of the Russian petrostate off from the source in a not much more space than it currently took to get from Belarus to Kiev, right? So yeah, in terms of like this whole idea of the defensible plain, like if that was Hitler's thrust in 1942, was to hit the Baku oil fields, not only to fuel his own war machine, but because by cutting that supply, the Russian mechanized army would have ground to a halt. It was no longer capable of doing that. Now, fortunately, that story gets hung up in Stalingrad, but that's the north-south line of communication in terms of logistics for like currently Russia's petrostate, but at that time also the strategic supply of oil to continue fighting a mechanized war. So that's why Ukraine becoming a member of NATO, if you do believe that NATO will be an aggressor state or that there is a potential for aggression in the future, because that's how you're viewing the situation from the Kremlin. That's why it's a red line.
Right. That's assuming, though, that the decision makers or the elite truly believe that the perception that we have gone through historically is still something that occupied their minds. I would think that there is no reason to deny that.
Right.
But that there are probably other calculations. But the point about Ukraine as being the place where you can cut off all communications, including exports, and Ukraine also being the place where you get your hot water port that doesn't freeze over winter.
And how you project influence abroad and down and south from into the Mediterranean.
So you take that all out.
Yep.
Russia is not a part of Europe.
Yep.
I mean, you can probably argue about whether or not Russia is in Europe for days, nights, months, years without the proper answer.
Yeah.
Because no one knows really.
European
it's
Russia
just a
versus
convention.
Russia. Yeah.
I mean, someone decided at some point that Europe ended in the Urals.
Yeah.
That wasn't a peer-reviewed process. Not like everyone sat at the table somewhere and said, "All right, guys, we haven't figured out that detail yet. Should we just get to it and say where this ends?"
Right.
No, it's just a convention, and that's part of the problem, because where does Europe end? I mean, for me, having studied Russia a bit, I'm amazed at the fact that there's always a contradiction in the Russian foreign policy and its core interests in and around Moscow.
Yep.
And its interest in Asia and those in Europe. There's always a pivot, like every couple of decades. Europe is the solution, and then no, it doesn't work. Asia is the solution, no, it doesn't work. Russia is stuck in both areas because of its territory.
Right.
And it doesn't really have a choice. It's in both places. And in a way, the fact that it has two very different directions to look at is a sort of curse, because there's also the possibility of abandoning Europe entirely and then focus in Asia, and then realizing, well, that's not enough. Then having to decide how much resources you put in each part. For me, that always have seemed to be a sort of geopolitical dilemma.
Yeah, and I mean one that's never been neatly solved by Russia. But especially you're talking about no longer becoming part of Europe. There's a really, really good book. I'm trying to remember the name of. I will.
We like really, really good books here.
Yeah.
Our listeners and viewers also like really good books. Don't you?
Yeah, of course, right? You wouldn't be here for this kind of talk otherwise. But it's all about a particular subset of Orientalism that is about how Central and Western Europe engages with Eastern Europe, and about how Eastern Europe and Russia, and like where does this begin? How it is Orientalized as a sort of like barbaric, uncivilized other, right? Through a discourse reaching from, I think they start in the early modern era, like early modernity, all the way up through modernity. And then the kind of conclusion of the book, if I recall correctly, kind of makes the leap either to 45 or sort of Cold War narratives. But the idea is that Russia remains, and you can see a lot of this in sort of post-war philosophy in Germany about as Nazism, the anti-Semitic elements of Nazism and the sort of Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy side of things is pushed into the background, and the respectable anti-communism is foregrounded. That becomes the threat from Moscow is still a driving force in German politics. But the CDU repackages this as one of sort of European culture versus, which again is a subcurrent that is all throughout Nazi propaganda. It's just this respectable anti-communism is repackaged to sort of reintegrate Germany into NATO, the alliance of Western nations, like the community of nations after Hitler and after the Holocaust, right? And it draws directly on this longer discourse about that. Again, I believe there are probably strong historical reasons grounded in the Great Migrations, the Goths, the Visigoths, you know, the Tartars, the Mongols, right? Like every invasion along this European plain highway on the east-west axis, right? East was always the direction that the invader came from, because that's the plane you can come tearing down.
That's what I wanted to jump on earlier.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to cut your narrative for us, because you were doing quite fine, quite well. It seemed to me that, you know, the threat from the West is a quite novel form of threat that for most of the history of Russia, which must date back from the 8th or 9th century, if you take the argument that the history of Russia starts in Kiev in Ukraine,
right?
That it's the first Muscovy in a sense. There's this idea that, well, in fact, the geographical threat posed by open spaces in the big Eurasian plain has often, in a very long time, come from the south. Like for most of the history, the invaders were from the south, right?
Interesting. Where does the narrative come from then?
Well, I think that the narrative hasn't changed; it's the direction that has changed.
Right.
In a way, you could say that the damages from the two recent invasions from Napoleon and Hitler,
right,
are much more significant in the sense that people living in Russia or the elite can connect to that because it's much more recent. It's powerful symbolically. I mean, you have this huge epic opera built on 1812,
right?
That is still like one of the most classical pieces of music ever.
Right.
That's not something. I mean, this is a powerful symbol. But this makes us forget that it makes us forget that the vast open territory is much bigger than the European plain. It's the center of Eurasia. The big open land, the big steppe. For centuries, Russia was occupied by foreign forces, if you want. The Golden Horde, for instance.
Right.
It doesn't change the fact that in recent memory, the invasions have been quite horrible and enormous. But I just wanted to point out that for the longest time, the invasion routes seem to have been from the south. It doesn't change anything to what is happening right now in Ukraine, I think.
Right.
Because, and I think we haven't really gotten to that part yet. So much suffering seems to have been focused in Eastern Europe, and not just Ukraine, but also Poland up to a certain extent, because it's the highway between East and West, because it's central, because these are huge territories. And I remember watching the movie Defiance with Daniel Craig.
Yeah.
And it's hard not to think of him as James Bond when you see him,
right,
walking in the woods, looking all serious. But let's forget Daniel Craig, and let's even forget the movie. There seems to have been so many groups with different affiliations working for, on the one hand, the Germans, on the one hand, the Russians. This ideology, this other ideology paints the picture of Ukraine and Poland and Eastern Europe in general as being extremely divided, right? As being at the center of it all.
Yeah. I mean, where did we leave off the big narrative, right? Like, then basically at the new economic policy and then collectivization. Again, so where our most recent attempt to sort of peel Ukraine off and make it its own entity, like the latest volley in sort of the back and forth in which Ukraine is perpetually the bargaining chip or the ball being kicked around, right? Was they'd been stood up under the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, right? Then they were incorporated into the Soviet Union. So again, whole new status within this. We usually forget 1917 as a threat to Russia because it's the birth of the Soviet Union, and so that rather overshadows that this was again another existential threat to that state. It's just the revolution, a new state came out the other side. So arriving in the Soviet Union by the late 1920s, there's you could probably speak to this better than I could, but the policy of collectivization is integral to the cultural politics and Ukrainian identity that's been built up post Cold War, right? Like in the Ukraine refers to it as the Holodomor, I believe is the pronunciation, which is the Great Famine. The historiography, there's two schools in the historiography around this particular event. The short version is the Soviet Union, in pursuing the policy of collectivization, had an extremely rapid appropriation of private property into the state collective farms over the winter of 1929, 1930. So in the course of about 6 months, from the previous harvest in 1929 until the planting in 1930, they went from, I think it's somewhere between 5 to 15% of all farmland being collectivized to 60%.
And that's in how many years?
That is in one winter before the next planting season.
Wow. These are very vivid images in my mind because the peasants were not giving up their land or their rights or their property willingly.
Right.
There must have been so much violence to support that.
Yeah. And, well, this is the other side of the famine. So you have this large disruption, and you have it over the winter before the next planting season. You have peasants who are they're not peasants anymore. They're now farmers because the Soviet Union has abolished the old system of serfdom. But they are peasants. Sorry, they're not serfs anymore. But the peasantry,
they have a nice title, but they're not necessarily in a much better position.
Yes, they are Soviet citizens now.
There you go.
So, regardless, they're not on board with the project of collectivization. The efficiency is much, much lower because they're not working for themselves anymore. You have all of the issues with this. This means that harvests plummet. Think about the dislocation that's associated with collectivizing. That is 60% of your farmland out of 1 year, right?
To be honest, it's a very difficult thing to imagine.
Yeah.
Because it requires you to abandon all basic notion of families, houses, communities. I mean, this has nothing to do with the town, village, or farmhouse that you and I understand as key linguistic concepts. No, a collective farm is not that. It's not great.
Yeah, and it's the first round of kolkhozes. It's the most Soviet of the kolkhozes, right?
Right.
Like, the most revolutionary in its nature, until it's kind of backed off to more like something more like you see in a co-op model. It's like this first initial forcing together and appropriation of the land. So harvests naturally suffer, and you are already in a position where you're not producing enough food at that point. Then the Soviet Union the party unleashes what are called the activists. So these tend to be like young Komsomol or urban party members.
And the Komsomol are the young communists?
Yes.
The youth?
Yes, the communist youth.
Right.
So these youth organizations are sending in their sort of most fervent young people who are going to go into the countryside and show the Soviet way to the peasants who lack the class consciousness of the urban worker and lack the sort of facility with Marxist doctrine that has the politicized urban worker has developed. And so they're going to go in and show them how to do this. But when they arrive with these mandates to basically drive up the numbers, meet the targets,
right.
Get the grain. And the thing is, nobody wants to work on the collective farm, so the grain hasn't been planted, or it rots in the field in some cases.
And that's because there's no incentive for the individual worker.
Right. And because, I mean, like, you just stolen all my land and now you're telling me I have to work for it for what?
Nothing.
Yeah.
Well, not much.
Yeah. And like, that's forced overnight.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not, but let's say it's bad change management, right? Like,
that sounds like a euphemism.
To put it mildly. So
we're all talking about the famine of Ukraine right here.
Yes, yes. When the activists then roll in, though, they begin to go through people's houses. This, I think I might have mentioned it in the last one, or maybe it was in the conversation. Everything Flows by Vasily Grossman. And
oh, right, yeah.
Yeah, this crushing chapter where you get this doublet of the description of this Ukrainian village starving to death, and then the description of the urban activists coming into the village after it had been wiped out.
I should point out for our viewers and listeners, I highly recommend reading Vasily Grossman. He was one of the top writers of the Soviet Union. He was a journalist. He was deployed on the Eastern Front during World War II. His notes from the war are breathtaking. They are particularly lucid, but they're also horrifying. He wrote a sort of epic trilogy, if you want, of the whole war as an experience that really gets you. It gives you the impression you're there on the front, and it's this is the limits of my English. I think it's quite grisly. That's not a word, is it? It's chilling. That's it. Sure. I don't know why I was thinking about grizzy. I mean, I don't think it's a word. Anyways,
gritty.
Gritty, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
But I mean, this particular description of the famine that he writes, and the emotional framing of it, and in Everything Flows, those two chapters. Like, I spent all my for a decade professionally studied genocide, and that was the only thing that ever got to me was that reading that was kind of like, that one got under my skin for some reason. Anyway.
Really?
Those two chapters. It's specifically the delivery of them. I don't want to rob them of their emotional impact.
Okay.
But it's in Everything Flows. Anyway, so these villages are starving to death. Millions and millions of people starve to death. So the Ukrainian, there's sort of like, let's say, a Kiev historiography and a Moscow historiography around the Great Famine and around the collectivization drive. At the end of 1930, in the fall, Stalin calls the whole thing to a halt and goes like, whoa, like, this is not working. This has been a bad idea. And he publishes an article called Dizzy with Success. So
Dizzy with Success?
Dizzy with Success in Pravda.
What is that?
Collectivization has gone so well, we can just call quits.
The sheer amount of disconnect I see in these words.
Yeah.
Ow.
Yeah. And well, I mean, the numbers were up, right? But like the thing was, the famine was driven by many of these activists going in and then confiscating either seed grain for the next year's planting, or for like the belief was, right? Remember, Soviet ideology is these kulaks, these fists, the wealthy peasants who are distinguished by being the ones who can afford to have a wrought iron bed frame. Right? They must be hiding the food because they were the exploiters to begin with. And so if there's not enough grain in the village to meet the targets, it must be because the kulaks have hidden it.
Once Stalin got into that, the distinction between kulak and anyone else, that got really nasty really fast, because the kulak is the one who's not yet starving. And the implication of that is the farmer is supposed to be starving so that the workers can not starve. And all of that is because of centrally and poorly planned policy, which invents numbers that have nothing to do with reality. That is truly horrifying, because as we talk about that, I can't help but thinking everyone must be lying through their teeth to make Stalin happy so that he doesn't that's not a word, personally execute them.
Well, we're not at 1936 yet in the Great Terror, but
see, it gets even worse.
Yeah, oh yeah. But at the same time, Pravda is publishing articles of like there will be a case where activists will find sacks of grain that have been hidden in mausoleum in a graveyard.
Mm-hmm.
And Pravda publishes an article. It's like, hey, look at what the filthy kulaks are doing. They had like nothing is sacred to them. They are hiding the grain.
Mm-hmm.
It's a sabotage. Well, they're not wreckers. That's urban, but like they're sabotaging the Soviet project. And like you say, all of this is based on centrally planned policy. Well, collectivization is going to will result in economies of scale and increases of efficiency because we're bringing everything together and managing it centrally. So we expect number to go up. But what you've done actually is reduce incentives and forcibly appropriate all this land from 60% of arable land at that point.
Right.
And so productivity is way down. So not only are you expecting numbers up here, right, your actual production is way down. So
the same things that make you expect productivity to go super high directly lead to productivity declining abruptly.
Yes.
But as I hear that, I wonder, because we are talking about the famine, we are talking about the process of collectivizing farms throughout the Soviet Union, or at least in some of the biggest countries. Do you have a sense of why it is that we have carved this specific word for the Ukraine, for the famine? Do you have a sense of why it seems to be hitting so hard on Ukraine versus other countries?
So this is what I was alluding to and kind of circling my way toward here, is that there is a Kiev historiography around this issue and there is a Moscow historiography around this issue. So on the Kiev historiography says that contends that, and probably the leading proponent of it in the English language would be Anne Applebaum, who
right.
Anyway,
she wrote a book about Putin, about why him and his entourage were targeted by Western sanctions.
Right.
It's a pretext. It's a pretense to really look at his history at St. Petersburg's the mayor's office there. He was in charge of external relations.
Right.
It's a fairly detailed account of his early professional career outside of the KGB.
Right. So like she has a background from sort of consular work in Poland toward the end of the Cold War, and has been at the Council of Foreign Relations. So she's done a bunch of different stuff. Extremely accomplished. Red Famine is the book that she put out on this from this perspective. There's also a bunch of other, or about the Holodomor specifically, from using the sort of like the Kiev historiography that's grown up academically around that. I think there's also Stalin's Genocides is another one that came out. That's a really short, sharp, slim argument. This gets into the definition, though, of genocide, which the Soviets originally wanted to include. Which originally, when developed by a Soviet legal scholar, included the definition of culture, which was then excluded at the insistence of the Soviet delegation at Nuremberg, specifically for things like the ethnicities operations during the nationalities operations during the Great Terror, things like this. So if you want to know more about that, Francine Hirsch has a really good book called Judgment at Nuremberg, which is from the Soviet perspective specifically. And the negotiations that take part in, like, one, where the definition comes from, how the Soviets get involved, and then how those backroom dealings play out. So anyway, she gives an excellent interview too, so she's worth listening to. Point being, Kiev, the Kiev historiography holds that this was an intentional action. Collectivization was pursued with the intent to conduct a cultural genocide and wipe out Ukrainian identity. And, well, not just a cultural genocide, but ultimate cultural genocide was the goal. The disruption of the famine was by design. It was a feature, not a bug, that was intended to attack Ukrainian identity.
And that is the Ukrainian traditional school of thought versus what happened during these years.
Yes. However, there is a broader historiography that debates this, because if you look at where in the Soviet historiography the famines that are associated with collectivization reach much broader than Ukraine. They reach across the whole breadbasket. And the mortalities reach not just in Ukraine, but in broader areas. Now, I haven't deeply engaged with this historiography. I can tell you there was enough there to engage in a pretty extensive debate in academic circles, and that it was hotly contested about as of 8 years ago, but that the Kyiv historiography is an official historical narrative. So as a professional historian, I always look at those askance, but having not engaged with it, I can't weigh in. I don't know.
What does it mean to be an official take on history? What is the repository of officialdom?
Well, as in like the officially endorsed historical narrative. So like right now, like the Law and Order Party in Poland refuses to acknowledge that Poles partook in the Holocaust and contributed HIVs and denounced Jews and were part of, like, assisted the Einsatzgruppen.
Okay.
Outright. They refuse to acknowledge that to use the Chinese parlance, it's historical nihilism, right? Like there is a...
You dropped the bomb there.
What?
Historical nihilism.
So, in China, to take a historiographic position that runs counter to the official narrative is an offense that is called historical nihilism. It's a political offense. It's not a codified one, but it's something that can, it can remove you from a position of influence if you're a professor of history, or end your career if you're in the party. So,
wow.
So Poland actually targeted one of the professors who works either at U Ottawa or Carleton, who has done research with the Gestapo case files. I know his work from the background research that I did on that. He worked with the Sichnau district files, and he was targeted in a smear campaign by the Polish government.
And because of what?
Because he was saying that Poles were active in denunciation of Jews in the Gestapo files.
And as usual, some people were involved in doing something to other things, and it's a subgroup of a subgroup doing things. But the implications are that the state is involved.
Well, no, it's not. The implication is not that the state is involved. And the issue is that it was pretty widespread. Like, if you read Grossman, his work, Fear especially, or not Fear, there's another one, Neighbors, is all about Polish involvement in the genocide. So, like, this is the thing, is that all of the Holocaust remains sort of this, and in the last 15 years has become increasingly politicized, where you have, like, the German Foreign Secretary Heiko Maas is issuing statements about wading into historiographic debates, validating the Polish position, because Germany's official political position is that it must take primary responsibility for the Holocaust, and therefore it positions itself against any historiography that tends to say, like, well, it wasn't just the Nazis, right? Like, it's also these domestic populations and historic European anti-Semitism that sees the opportunity to push the Holocaust. And
that seems dangerous to me, not because of the content, not because of the arguments, but because of the simple fact of an official position on history. For me, history is a method of investigation, right? That's the name. That's what history means. If you go back to Herodotus, you can't have an official position on history, but I think it extends to science as well. I mean, you can say you support something, but you can't say that officially or diplomatically X is Y scientifically. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Wow.
So, but it's anyway, all of this is to say that there are like this is a politicized historiography, and the Great Famine and the Holodomor has been the subject of great discussion. Soviet historiography has been fascinating for the last 20 years, because essentially the secret archives opened free game in 1991, and then about 15 years ago, right, it was like, nope, you can't look at Stalin's archive anymore. Nope, you can't look at it. Like,
There was a window of opportunity, and it seems not to have closed.
Yep.
And one of the guys who was lucky enough to get access to most of the juicy archives from the Soviet Union is Professor Kotkin.
Don't know.
He is probably the most well-informed person now in the life of Stalin.
Right.
He wrote 3 books, a trilogy that is in fact effectively a biography of Stalin.
Right.
The depth of details, because everything is based on archives.
Right.
Soviet archives.
Right.
He's been there for a long time. And one of there are many cool things that comes from his work, and one of the most interesting things is there isn't much cynicism in Soviet thinking at the time of Stalin.
Right.
In the sense that the language that Stalin is using is very much the language of Marx.
Right.
In other words, these guys aren't playing around. They're not pretending. Marx is very much real in their thoughts and their thinking. Even in Stalin, who you might say is not a true socialist, because he deviates from some of the core principles. For instance, the permanent revolution, the revolution for the world. Stalin just takes his time, and he clashes with Trotsky over a permanent revolution and a global revolution. Trotsky thinks there can be no revolution unless it's global, and Stalin decides to make revolution in his country, and then he'll see, right? But the point for that is it's it's a source of information that has been open, and that is now, for political reasons that perhaps are obvious to our viewers and our listeners, led to their closure.
Yep. So during this 10-year period, there was a lot of new work that was done with all this new information, and a lot of the old Soviet historiography and, East versus West historiographies were starting to move toward a sort of post-Soviet, post-Cold War synthesis based on new sources and access to unclassified sources from both sides of the Iron Curtain. That window started to close about 15 years ago as Putin started to establish an official historiography that rehabilitated Stalin as a great man who moved the Soviet Union forward. Yes, at a cost of great blood, that was always acknowledged, but necessary for the survival of the Soviet Union in the face of an existential threat from the West.
And that seems to have taken root because, and this is another thing that I got from the many conferences from Professor Kotkin. He's done many interviews and is a great explainer. One of the things he said was, Stalin has been rehabilitated. You'd be surprised or shocked to see how many people now in Russia view Stalin as overall a positive thing compared to a negative thing. And the percentages are quite worrying. And that's mostly because he's won the war. And that matters because Russia has seen itself as under siege for a long time, and that narrative has been quite reinforced under Putin. So you have this narrative background that's already ready for you to see Stalin as a different figure, as the guy who won the war. And once you get into that, well, then you can excuse the rest. Or you're invited to excuse the rest, right?
Yeah, all for the greater good.
There you go. Well, all of this is very messy. There's no absolute winner in history. And I think that one of the things that I get from this discussion, and I think we should close with that, is it should be very worrying when any state has an official position on history, and when that is allowed to dominate any discourse on history. It's true with any country, Russia, Poland, or any other country that I can think of, or Germany, because we're talking about Germany. It's a very messy state of affairs when you get to history as something you only look to justify political actions. Because history should be something distinct. Only if you have the distance with history can you actually get something useful inside from it. Right?
Yeah.
All right. You know what? I think you should have another sip of that delicious IPA.
Indeed.
And as we sip through these delicious beers, I will remind our listeners and viewers that they are allowed to subscribe. This is a free country, and this is a free internet, and this is also a free podcast. If you've liked our discussion, don't hesitate to send us a few questions or suggestions for topics you'd like to see us engage in. So thanks for watching. This is Hoppy History, and thanks very much, Ryan, for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Cheers.
Cheers.